The largest combat update since the evolution of combat in 2012 has finally arrived. After months of beta tests and a few delays, the original 3 combat styles have finally received a much needed facelift: magic, ranged and melee. Jags have stated they wanted to simplify the system by reducing ability bloat and give a more clear identity to each style. And that's not even all. We saw the removal of combat auras, changes to how food works, and even the reintroduction of proper style weaknesses. Whilst I might not be a Grandmaster Combat achievement haver, I do think I have a good understanding on how combat is actually played. So, in this video, I'll be covering what this update means to us, the average RuneScape players, on a day-to-day basis. And by the end of the video, I want to be able to answer one simple question: has combat actually become easier to understand for the average RuneScape player? I also want to know from you, what do you think of these changes? No matter where you stand in progression, this update affects every single person who interacts with the combat system in RuneScape, and I want to hear from you in the comment section down below. Don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe if you are new to help me reach my goal of 15k subscribers by the end of the year. Enough yapping, my name's Chevalric, and let's see if combat has actually become easier to understand. For this video, I want to touch on all the moving parts that play a role in making combat more approachable. However, before we can get to the nitty-gritty of things, we should start off with some basic changes that have a huge impact on how we all interact with combat. Let's start off with the changes made to food. It's something most of us tend to use in combat encounters, but there has always been one big drawback when using most types of foods like pies, lobsters, sharks, sailfish, etc. And that was the 10% adrenaline drain for chomping a piece of food. People often refer to food that drains adrenaline to hard food. There are also items like Ceridome brews or blue blubber jellyfishes that don't drain your adrenaline at all, but besides them costing a fortune, they also had various drawbacks like Ceridome brews reducing your stats and blue blubbers not healing a big amount. Whilst the latter remains unchanged, the former has been changed in a huge way with this update. Food no longer drains 10% adrenaline and instead now only drains 3%. On top of that, food now also heals their assigned amount and no longer scales of hit points level. Yes, I refuse to call it Constitution. If we take a Rocktail for example, it would have healed you 2300 health if you were above 90 hit points, but when you were below it, for example at 40 hit points, it would only heal you 1000 health. Before these changes, you really only had 2 options regarding the use of food. Use super expensive, non-adrenaline draining foods like blubbers or brews, or use foods like rocktails that would drain your adrenaline by 10% with each bite and heal less if you didn't have the relevant hit points level. The second option is what the majority of players would use, and it resulted in quite a disastrous gameplay loop. You would get hit by a powerful attack from a boss, you eat a piece of food, lose 10% adrenaline, resulting in you not being able to do a more powerful ability to slay the boss quicker, for the fight to only prolong, to then have to eat more food and repeat the cycle. This is a huge change for early/mid game players, and even to an extent endgame players, as eating hard food now becomes a viable method to sustain instead of a punishing trade-off. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great that the player is rewarded for playing it a bit risky and possibly not eating, but the old system made it so punishing that you would get stuck in that earlier mentioned loop. I'm generally convinced that this change will help newer players to slay some bosses and no longer be so confused anymore on why they have no adrenaline to do their powerful abilities. Another thing that impacts everyone are style weaknesses. You know, that little icon next to a monster's name? Yeah, they now actually impact your hit chance properly. Hit chance being that percentage number next to a creature's health. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of style weaknesses, let's quickly go over what hit chance actually means in the first place. In RuneScape, you will always hit with your ability, meaning that you will never hit a 0 or splash. The amount you hit is affected by many variables like gear, levels and buffs, but the main thing you need to know is that with the same gear at 100% hit chance, you sometimes do 1000 damage and sometimes you do 1200 damage. This is because of this lovely thing called RNG. The way hit chance works in specific is as follows. Let's say your hit is calculated to be 1000 when hitting a creature. If you have 100% hit chance, your hit will do the 1000 damage on that specific target. Simple enough. Let's take that same example of a calculated 1000 damage, but apply it to a monster you only have 75% hit chance on. The game still calculates your hit to be 1000 damage, yet it will only put out 750 damage, as the 25% hit chance you are missing will be subtracted from the initially calculated damage. Most of the regular mobs in this game have a style weakness, yet a lot of the bosses do not. Jagex did however add some style weaknesses to some early and mid game bosses, as shown on screen, and it is something they're exploring adding across the board, so let them know how you feel about it. And personally, I would love to see more of this, but I'm kinda getting ahead of myself here. This doesn't mean that for every single creature you would need a different style, as in most scenarios your levels or gear are high enough and you will be getting that 100% hit chance regardless of a mob style weakness. However, in certain scenarios where creatures have higher defensive stats, your gear isn't up to par, or when you want to take on a creature that's slightly above your level, it becomes worth using the correct style against it, as it will give you a significant hit chance buff. I'm personally a huge fan of this, as this makes it worth you getting different styles of equipment instead of just having whatever is meta or easy to get and pretty much ignoring everything else. The beauty of RuneScape, to me at least, is that you aren't locked into one style like most MMOs, but I feel like we kind of lost that over the years, where it didn't really matter which style you would use, as they were all good everywhere. This new system rewards you using different styles, but also makes it so that you can still use your favorite style anywhere. It will just be worse than the best in slot style. Another major thing that affects most people are auras. All combat enhancing auras, besides vampirism and penance, have been removed. Their power has been redistributed over the now increased 120 combat stats, which to clarify, defense and hit points are not included in that. The neat little graph you've been staring at for the last 10 seconds or so is actually how this affects your level in particular. In short, pre-99, you've actually become stronger, which is the blue line. There are also some smaller tweaks made to the overall interaction with the combat system that you need to know about. First of all, can we have a round of applause for Jagex taking this great suggestion of Reddit? The new layout of the ability books. It is so clear now what an ability is and in what category it sits in. Kudos to Jagex there. The keen-eyed individuals amongst you might have noticed two new categories: utility abilities and enhanced abilities. The former being abilities that help you in combat but don't do actual damage. Things like the movement abilities Search and Dive. Enhanced ability is the new name for the formerly known threshold ability. They work the exact same and are the abilities that will do more damage spending your adrenaline. Setting up an action bar actually has become a million times easier as well. You can now simply right click the little cogwheel and auto set up your bars. This used to give you a mediocre at best ability bar, but Jagex has worked with the community to make these presets actually good. So it's worth considering when setting up an action bar. To summarize what we got so far, food has been improved to be less punishing to use, style weaknesses have become more relevant, and some quality of life features have been added. What about the original 3 styles, their progression, and what has changed with them in specific? To properly test this out, I decided to start a fresh account where I played through the first 20 levels of melee, magic, and ranged. My aim was to see how the new ability unlock progression feels, if the effects of abilities have become more clear, and if these changes teach new players about slightly more complex aspects of the combat system, like ability rotations. When you start off a new account, you only have a basic attack ability unlocked. Every style now has a unique basic attack ability, formerly known as auto attack, that is just a simple style themed attack that generates 9% adrenaline, just like any other basic ability. These basic attacks work the exact same for each combat style and have no special effects added to it. The only one that differs is the magic one, as the magic basic attack applies the effect of your spell. So for example, when you are using Blood Barrage, your basic attack will have the healing effect of Blood Barrage, or when you're using a nerf spell, your basic attack will become, well, a nerf spell. Starting off with this one simple ability effectively teaches the player, hey, use this ability to build adrenaline. Then after a few levels, you unlock your first enhanced ability, allowing you to spend the adrenaline. This leads into you doing a simple rotation meaning the order of abilities you use, to do the most amount of damage possible with the adrenaline available to you. After unlocking your first enhanced ability, your rotation becomes build adrenaline with your basic attack ability and then spend adrenaline with your enhanced ability to then repeat this again. Super simple, but such an important addition to the game. Before this update, you would start off with 5 abilities and kind of had no clue what they all did or how they work together. Now that you unlock them one at a time, by the time you unlock your next one, you are familiar enough with the previous ability and you can figure out how this addition might fit into your little rotation. That is, if you read the big pop-ups that appear when unlocking a new ability. Seriously, read them as they give quite a clear indicator of what something actually does. Whilst testing, I found myself doing a pretty cool little rotation with magic, where I did Sonic Wave into Dragon Breath, a basic attack, and then Wild Magic to do the big damage and then repeat the whole thing again. This system allows people to get into rotations early on, as that is such an important aspect for future content. The only issue I've found is that with the lack of abilities and low cooldown on your first enhanced ability, it was impossible to build up to your first unlocked ultimate ability, like Omnipower from Magic, whilst using the Revolution combat style that automatically cast abilities for you. I do want to clarify one thing though, this is only really an issue in the early game. Once you have gotten more abilities unlocked, this no longer really applies, so don't worry, you can still AFK your combats once you have some more abilities available to you. However, I was curious about this design, so I've asked ModPigeon, one of the developers that worked on this project, what was up with this, and this was his response. I think ultimately, this comes down to it being okay to revo, meaning revolution, your threshold, now known as enhanced abilities, early on. But there being some skill expression, even in the early game, of, okay, I want to use my basics in this order to better utilize my adrenaline. What I gathered from this is that when you want to use something like Omnipower, costing you 60% adrenaline, the devs want to encourage you to press the basic abilities manually to build up your adrenaline yourself before Revolution can spend your build up adrenaline on a low cooldown enhanced ability. Or to take it one step further, encouraging you to press all adrenaline spending abilities manually and only cast basics using Revolution to optimize your damage output early on. Whilst I think the philosophy behind this idea is good, many players would just whack the new ability in the next open slot like I did and then wonder why it's never triggering. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one side, you are encouraging players to play semi-manually, which is a good thing to get into to eventually get better at the game, but at the same time, you're also stopping them from using their first, most powerful unlocked ability, which can feel bad. Even when in reality, the 3 wild magics you can cast with that same adrenaline using Revolution do more damage in the grand scheme of things. You also just want to press shiny new big damage button, right? Let me know actually what you think about this one, as I can definitely see both sides of this argument, and quite frankly, I'm not really sure if there's actually a good solution to this. Now that we covered abilities and their progression, how does this stack up against the lower hit chances you find in the early game and your overall sense of progression? I found that these style weaknesses did feel very important, as the lack of hit chance early on was a bit rough, as your damage output is pretty dog in the first place because, well, you are low level. Having a high hit chance and using the correct styles almost felt mandatory. That is not a bad thing per se, however, from my findings on this fresh account you've been seeing in the background, is that it can be hard to find creatures with certain weaknesses to ranged and melee in specific. This results in your variety of creatures pretty much being trolls for both of them, so adding some more accessible low-level monsters with these weaknesses wouldn't hurt. The flip side of this, however, is that with each level, you do feel like you are getting stronger. Like I mentioned before, levels are a part of your hit chance calculation. So when you are gaining the quick levels in the early game, you do actually feel like you are getting stronger quite fast. Adding the more powerful abilities available to you, new weapons to equip, and you really do get a sense of proper progression, which I gotta be honest about, did feel pretty good and I had a lot of fun. One thing I did find, however, is that ammo has become a bit more important for ranged and magic. Before these changes, you could pretty much buy a couple hundred runes or arrows, and that would last you for literal hours. However, after this update, the consumption rate of runes and arrows have been changed, where you now actually use runes 20% of the times when using a magic ability, and the same goes for arrows when using a ranged ability. The latter actually dropped to the ground again, like back in the day, so having an AVAS device from the Animal Magnetism quest actually becomes quite useful again for early and mid-game players, so you don't have to pick up your arrows yourself. At face value, this might seem like a negative change, but overall I think it's a lot better in the grand scheme of things. This teaches players that they need to keep their resources in mind and use them accordingly, instead of just spamming everything. The only thing that Jagex needs to be careful of, as this obviously also affects mid and endgame players, is that the ammo spending doesn't become so ridiculous that it gets too expensive to use for the average player. So I'm hoping they do keep a good eye on it and adjust possible shop stocks, crafting processes or drops accordingly. Now, it is time to tie all these things together and answer the question I posed at the start of the video. Has combat actually become easier to understand for the average RuneScape player? The biggest improvement in my eyes is the removal of all the clutter abilities and starting a new player off with just one simple ability, a basic attack, and then unlocking your first enhanced ability after a couple of levels. This teaches the player that you can generate adrenaline with basic abilities to then spend that adrenaline on more powerful enhanced abilities. They even managed to give you a bit of a small rotation around level 20 where you do 2 or 3 basic abilities to build adrenaline into an enhanced ability, which really does feel satisfying. The biggest gap between endgame PvM and new players, in my eyes at least, was that we were kind of playing a different game. Sure, there is still a huge difference between taking on an endgame boss like Solak with various buffs, rotations, mechanics and whatnot, and slaying skeletons in the Lumbridge Catacombs. But the fact you can now do a bit of a rotation as well, get the fundamentals down and truly start learning what these abilities actually do is a huge step in reducing this gap towards the endgame. All of this is not even mentioning the huge buff to using hard foods, increasing sustain at bosses, and finally eliminating the toxic cycle of not having enough adrenaline to actually do abilities when you are still learning a piece of content and taking a lot of damage. The only thing I'm a little bit worried about are the style weaknesses and how they will affect the lower level players. Are there enough creatures with weaknesses to each style in the early game? Because to me, it seems like the majority of them are mainly weak to magic. Hopefully, this won't create accounts where people have a vastly higher magic level than ranged and melee because they just weren't able to slay enough creatures with the respective other 2 combat styles, or just had to grind out that one creature that just happens to be weak to it, like trolls. So with all that being said, yes, I am truly convinced that this makes combat easier to understand for the average RuneScape player. But what do you think? Let me know down below, leave a like in the video and subscribe. My name's Chevalric and I'll see you guys in my next video.